And then secondly, three questions over there. Go ahead, sir.
It is on? Okay.
Yeah.
Dimitrios Trentafilou, Center for International European Studies at Khadir University in Istanbul. It's very interesting, this debate. I think, first of all, really this multipolar world, multipolar Europe idea might be outdated, in part because of what SERHAT...
You've got to hold the microphone really close.
In part because of what SERHAT has mentioned, which has to do with Turkey and keeping Turkey in Europe and so on, and therefore one could wonder, because this debate is going on in Turkey itself, as to whether it is a part of Europe or not. I just wonder whether we can reshape the issue. We can reshape the issue a bit differently. In terms of talking about issues, and I think what's happening right now in North Africa and the Middle East, and how energy stakes are important, and trade concerns, and maritime issues and so on, we can focus on sort of a dialogue of the seas. The Black Sea was mentioned. We talk about the Mediterranean. And this is what binds us, or all the powers in Europe together. Energy, trade, transport, maritime transport, and so on. And I wonder whether we can sort of rethink that, and adding to it maybe then some sort of social context as to why it makes sense for each side to actually work together in these issues.
Right.
And so this is my question.
Well, I love the idea of having a Europe of many seas rather than of many poles, but as well, in a landlocked country, I think you have to add rivers as well, otherwise it would be unfair. Can we have the microphone over here? We've got three questions. Have we got a microphone on this side? Hello. Can we have two gentlemen there? Turn around, madam. Sorry. No, behind you. Two there, and then Bobo Low. Go ahead.
Thank you. Jacques Rosier from the Belgian Euro-Atlantic Association, the president. I have understood that the title is a little bit confusing, and I also should say that I was confused by the title. If we do speak about European order, I think we do speak indeed from history point of view and not future looking. That we experience a multipolar Europe today is probably the result of history. And my question now goes to Mr. de Zwaan. When he said that CFSP was not well developed, well, CFSP is just a very young-born child. And when he said that Lisbon failed, well, it was not easy to get Lisbon through. And, well, you can speak perhaps for your country, but others were pushing harder. And Lisbon is a compromise, as we should work in European Union fields. So I would like to ask you how you state your failure. Is it a short-time failure, or is it a vision for long-term? And I could elaborate that it is not a failure if you look what has been done in a short term. Since we do have Lady Ashton, she has a full-fledged organization, but she still misses necessary skills. And it is multipolar because we have big countries in Europe. But the aim is to go pragmatically to smaller solutions. And the same is on the Council. The Council meets now, and every Council has a result. We had a budget, we have energy policy, etc. So please elaborate. Is it short or long term? And do you agree that multipolar is the future of Europe?
Thanks. Just give the microphone to the gentleman next to you. That's good. Hang on. I want to give JAAP a chance to respond to that, because sceptics might say that when the External Action Service officials have the right to sign checks and to send secure emails, then we can start taking it seriously. But that may be a rather sort of unfairly empiricist approach. But you will just respond very, very quickly to this allegation you're being too premature in writing it off.
Yes. Well, in fact, it's right. I mean, European integration is a gradual process, so I understand that. I worked, when I was in the diplomat, the Dutch diplomatic service, I worked on Maastricht, on Amsterdam, even on the European thing. So I know that. The only thing I see that in the world as it is changing now, the multipolar world, where the mechanisms for global governance, United Nations, are becoming weaker and weaker, and where we are confronted with BRICS upcoming powers, we have to face what is the role, what's the responsibility of the European Union. And in that context, I think Europe is not very well developed. That means economically it is. It is a member of WTO. In fact, through mechanism, asylum, immigration, we're doing rather well. But I think this is, in fact, one of the sovereign areas where member states, at least a number of them, because I'm sure that the majority of all the member states is really in favor of creating something. But of course, you are faced with the past and the relations. So France, the United Kingdom, Germany, we also, the Netherlands, have an historical past with our own relations with third countries everywhere in the world. But I think if we want to keep a position in this new discussion, we have to make that last step as well. It's a gradual process, so I think this is the real defect at the moment, which has to be solved in the future. And in fact, Lady Ashton, of course, well, I do not want to marginalize her role, but of course, I see it personally a bit as a label. But a label cannot in itself create the instruments for a common policy. So the poor lady, of course, it's nice to be hybrid, but if you do not have the instruments and modalities, what can she achieve? Right. So that's a bit my difficulty in that.
Good. So go ahead, and then after that, Bobo Low, and then Ginnik Smolar. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Martin Swarovski from Czech Embassy to Warsaw. I want to refer also to what has been said here on Georgia-Russian crisis and what it meant. It has been said that it meant the end of Russian adventurous imperial policy. I wish really that it is the case, but I have my doubts. It is true that since then Russia did not launch any such adventure policy, but we have to take into account that there has not been really any structural change in Russia in this term. The Russian military doctrine has not changed substantially. The composition of the army has not changed. There is still the same leadership in Russia. And Russia, unfortunately, still does not accept the principle of host nation consent in terms of conventional arms treaty. So I wish that the structural change really happens. We have now a positive atmosphere after the NATO Lisbon summit, and we should support continuation of such a positive atmosphere and cooperation. But we should bear in mind that so far the really deep structural change has not changed.
Oksana, I tell telepathically that the next two questions are going to have a Russia angle as well, so I'll come to you after that. Bobo Low. Madam, can you bring the microphone to the front, please? Bobo Low, please. Thank you.
Yes, on Russia and Europe. Clearly things look rather bad at the moment, but I would like the panellists to cast their minds a little bit forward and to say sometime like in 2025. We've heard lots of talk about an alliance of Europe, a union of Europe, and in a perfect world, the perfect world of Sergei Karaganov, you would have, in a sense, Russian hard power allied to European soft power. But there's an alternative scenario for 2025, is that by that time, this alliance of Europe, if one such exists, is really an alliance of the increasingly weak, the increasingly marginalized, and the increasingly desperate. So I would be interested in your views. Oksana, on Russia and Europe, it's interesting to me. I take a different view to you on the extent of Russia's commitment to shifting its foreign policy east. But that's a discussion for another time. My question to you is, what happens when the major Asian powers actually show no interest in Russia playing a much greater role in the Asia-Pacific region? So that Russia, the disillusionment that you see in Moscow vis-à-vis Europe, is then paralleled by a disillusionment towards Asia in Moscow. What does Russia do then? Does it go back to Europe, or does it plough an increasingly lonely furrow? Thank you.
Lovely, lonely furrow. Can you pass the microphone over to Ginnik?
Well, you are absolutely right. It's Russia again. The problem with Russia and
But,
those who watch it rather closely is that Russia does not offer any positive solutions. This is a problem with the finding Russia as a partner, because Russia and Karaganov and Lukyanov and others have been writing, we are ideal partners with the European Union. We will strengthen ourselves, whether soft power terms or economic development, etc. But the realities on the ground are that when you talk to the strategists there, they do not actually, you ask them, okay, so you stopped the NATO enlargement, and now what? And there is a dead silence. They want to be treated as a partners, but they are not as a partners bringing to the table some solutions. The problem I have is a bit of with Ukraine. And Grigory, we did have this discussion some years ago. I mean, when you talk to the Europeans, don't talk about the assets because they don't understand what you are talking about. Frankly, full stop. We did have this discussion in Kyiv. This is a geopolitical, I made this point, this is geopolitical argument, and we love Poles, we love geopolitics, but actually we have 27 geopolitics in the European Union. You can't go that far. And the fact of the matter is that when we talk, and this is a very important argument concerning Turkey, the role of the trade, for the first 6 months of last year, the trade of Germany with Russia was at the level of 26 billion, including import of oil and gas. That means at the level of the Czech Republic, and with Ukraine it was 6 billion. That's causa finita. That means Ukraine, because of lack of reform and because lack of adaptation, actually chooses itself to be out of the real business. And now the last thing is I didn't like the report of this is the first report I really disliked of this. And I thought it's funny. I thought it's strange, extraordinary to propose that we are going to have some kind of a form of negotiation between Europe, that means European Union, Turkey and Russia. I didn't find it the substance of this negotiation. And you were absolutely right when you have suggested that Turkey plays a much bigger role because of its activities, not necessarily military activities, but trade activities, including Georgia, for example. Abkhazia now, I've heard, you are going there, etc. That's an interesting phenomenon.
Thanks very much. If anyone from the ECFR is here and wants to defend the report, can they please make themselves known? I want to come to OKSANA next. So Ginnik was too modest to say that trade with Russia is on the same level as the Czech Republic, but it's trade with Poland, I think, is 3 times greater than the trade with Russia in those statistics you cited. Now, OKSANA, give a really substantial response to these very interesting points that were made about Russia, and then I'll come to Grigory next from answer Ginnik's point on Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the first question, I very much hope that your next posting would be in Moscow, so I think you'll have a chance to maybe see a little bit more from the inside rather than from Prague of what's happening. But in fact, in terms of the military reform in Russia, we have seen in the last, and I don't have time to actually talk about it, but you can read my chapter in the ISS Military Balance, which is just coming out actually next week. We are launching it. But we have seen the most fundamental defense reform Russia had seen in the last 200 years, easily. It is unbelievable. I've been working on the Russian military issues now for 20 years. I never, ever could have imagined in my wildest dreams that this could happen. Over the last year, they cut down 90% of Russian ground forces units. Closed. We now have, actually, for the first time, almost completely civilian group around the defense minister who are actually making decisions on defense policy. Unbelievable. You cannot imagine that ever happening in Russia. It never existed even in the imperial Russia. And so on and so forth. Of course, it's still a very long way to go before Russia has a modern armed forces and might not actually even have one because, of course, those experiments in the past, if we go by historic track record, rarely ended in success. But what we do not have anymore for sure is the Soviet armed forces. Because what happened in the last 2 years is that the Soviet army, the last vestige of the Soviet Union in Russia, has been destroyed. Destroyed. They fired 70% of officers now, completely fired. So there's no one now. Even in the defense academies now, they have suspended taking new students for 2 years because they want to reduce the number of officers and finally bring in the new generation into armed forces. They understood, looking at what happened in the Georgian war, that Russia has the armed forces that cannot even carry out the contingency, in a war of that kind. what kind of other challenges it can face. So in that sense, the change is actually fundamental. In terms of doctrine, the defense doctrine, it's also a change, a very big change. Of course, if you look from the outside, the fact that NATO enlargement is still mentioned there is an irritation. I agree. I don't think they should have mentioned that. But it is mentioned in a completely different context. It is not mentioned as a threat. It is mentioned as a potential danger, and not NATO, but NATO enlargement. And that is a fundamental change from the previous defense doctrine. If you look what President Medvedev had said speaking to the Russian diplomats just a few months ago on the Russian priorities of Russian foreign policy, CIS, countries of the post-Soviet space, were not mentioned. You just look at what was happening before in the Russian foreign policy. The first 5 priorities always was post-Soviet space. Now they do not exist. And when Kyrgyzstan crisis happened and the Kyrgyz government turned to Russia to say, do something about it, the question from Moscow was, no, we're not going to intervene. Even though there was absolutely legitimate case for Russia to intervene because of the CSTO commitments it has to Kyrgyzstan, which is a member, and it requested intervention of some kind. They said no. And therefore, I think this is a fundamental shift from where we were in 2008, where Russia would have intervened in Kyrgyzstan even before it was asked. It would have stayed there for another 20 years, as it did in the South Caucasus and in Georgia. It's a different environment we live in today. Of course, the question is what kind of challenges are going to emerge. And of course, if tomorrow we have a collapse of several Central Asian regimes and nobody else intervenes, Russia is going to have to intervene because it is going to pay the price. There are no borders between Kazakhstan and Russia. It's 5,000 kilometers, almost open space. Now, about the question of Asia, is Russia not welcomed in Asia? I'm not entirely sure about that, Bobo. I mean, we run, as ISS, we ran for 10 years the Shangri-La Dialogue, the meeting of defense ministers of Asia Pacific. And last year, for the first time, Russia's deputy prime minister came. And I was really amazed of how much interest there was of what Russia has to say on Asian issues. And mainly, maybe it is because Russia is coming to that region with no baggage, no historical baggage. I mean, here in Europe, whatever Russia says on European security architecture is immediately seen in historic terms. I mean, it doesn't matter what Russia says, what people hear is a different story. And it will persist for a few generations. We have to accept that. In Asia, that doesn't exist. And I think the fact that the Russians view their engagement in Asia not as a way to try to shape regional security system, as they want to do here in Europe, but actually try to do it in their self-interest, to develop Siberia and Far East, not to be entirely just dependent on China, but to bring in other players, to play a role there. For example, Russian-South Korean relationship now really developing very actively, and they're trying to bring in Indian investors in the Far East. They're trying to do this and that. So this is a plea of necessity. They understand that Asia, whether they want it or not, they have to deal with it, and they have neglected that for many years because West was a priority. So I'm not entirely sure that Russia will be disappointed because the expectations are very low and there is no historical baggage. And we'll see. I mean, Russia is hosting the APEC summit next year in Vladivostok. Something will happen. There is, more work now on the 6-party talks. There is, more investment, etc. They just formulated new Asia-Pacific strategy. It's a very interesting document. It's certainly more interesting than the European strategy. Now, the final point about does Russia offer solutions? Who offers solutions? Who offers solutions to protracted conflicts? There's no one, because some of those conflicts do not have solutions. And I think we are concluding that now in Cyprus, and I'm with the UN, understanding that, sooner or later we have to say, okay, where is the solution? What is the solution on Nagorno-Karabakh? Very hard to see. On Transnistria, there is a perception that Russia can just impose a solution on Transnistrian conflict. I do not think so. I think it is very difficult to see what kind of solutions Russia can offer at the moment. In a situation where it is completely preoccupied with its own domestic challenges, it has war going on in the North Caucasus, it has terrorism in its capital, which is going to accelerate further, it has elections coming up, it has all sorts of challenges, and you think in that environment Russia has capacity to offer solutions?
That's very interesting. I've also heard it said that it would, if Russia wanted to solve the Transnistrian conflict, it would take less than a morning. It would be a matter of 2 or 3 phone calls. So there's obviously wide room for debate there.
That's what we thought in South Ossetia, of course, or in Abkhazia. Russia just calls and the conflicts are all solved.
But I'm going to come to Grigori in a moment. But perhaps when you make your response to Ginnet, you could also talk about a little bit about Transnistria, because that's also obviously a Ukrainian issue as well. And what I thought was very interesting, you were saying who's offering solutions. Well, actually, the Germans have got involved with this. The Germans are involved in Macedonia, the Germans are involved in Transnistria, and actually saying to the Russians, if you want to be treated as security partners, let's try and solve the least difficult of the four protracted conflicts. And I think that's it will be a very interesting test of Russia's capability to engage on this. But go ahead, Grigori.
Yeah, a very right question. And in this case, Ukraine does matter for those efforts, or renewed efforts, to solve Transnistria, whether it's part of the new efforts on the Germany or multilateral efforts. And by the way, answering Bobo's question, looking for the future, I think the only conflict that has some credible chance to be solved by year 2025 is precisely Transnistrian conflict. I'm much more skeptical of others, whether Nagorno-Karabakh or the situation in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Why Transnistria? Not just because of proximity of Transnistria to EU, not just because it has some goodwill information, but because of two additional issues. The most successful Moldova will become, showing how quick many improvements could be made domestically, the more appeal that would have as far as the Transnistria part is concerned. That's why the same applies for Ukraine. Ukraine is formally part of the 5+2 arrangement, but that means also the more successful Ukraine will become, and the more convincing will be its role, whether just to be one of a party looking for either aligning with the Russian position, which is currently a concern, not critically, or just moving with the wind. Then the other part of it has to do with whether you seriously believe in the modernization efforts in Russia. So if this is a deep thought through and real modernization, it involves a very important part of it, not just the modernization of the army, but of course modernization deep enough to reform also the security police, but also to reform political system. So, and in this way, it also poses the challenge. And by year 2025, I quite have my doubts that it would happen in this best case scenario, which leaves other options, like by year 2025, we definitely will see more China present in the region, not just because of the clear geopolitical, geostrategic interest to prevent the erosion of the post-Cold War status quo in the region, but also for the pragmatic reasons. There are something that they could get and they're interested in. And in this way, definitely we will see more China on that. Definitely, I hope by that time Ukraine will be able to preserve a very important part that differentiate a fabric of society and even political system still of Ukraine from the other less successful cases in the post-Soviet countries, and would finally use this opportunity that have not been used in the past. And answering getting questions, it matters, because if EU is serious about projecting its soft power and its appeal, power of attraction, there should be a minimum compatibility with where you want to project it. As we saw in Belarus, it didn't work. It is not working for some reason, but where it will work and it should work, it's got countries like Ukraine, like Belarus, like Moldova. And also, it's a big question, but if the Georgian leadership would avoid authoritarian trap still, which might be the option, Georgia may show also a kind of success story. Because, again, what is important, success stories that are not very many, if at all, in the last 20 years in the post-Soviet space. Ukraine demonstrated such success story, and therefore it's a challenge also for the EU to build on this for its own naked self-interest.
Right. Okay. Very good. I'm going to have a few quick points before we go to our final remarks, because we're eating into your lunch break a little bit. Gentleman here in the front, please introduce yourself. Then further back, and then Jana to finish with. Go ahead.
Ambassador.
You just have to start talking. It'll work in a moment.
It works. Ambassador İldem from Turkey. I listened carefully to the interventions of each panelist and the questions, comments. Well, there are a few points that I would like to emphasize. Professor ZWAAN was right in mentioning that EU was a bit late in having an honest relationship with Turkey. And I don't know whether we are in such a course because I don't think that we have such an honesty at this moment as well. Because on the one hand, many chapters are blocked and we see diminishing support of the public opinion in Turkey, and we don't know how the process can be sustainable. But putting aside the pace of this negotiating process, EU was not innovative enough to put in place mechanisms to hold strategic dialogue with Turkey. Yes, indeed, Turkey is very active in its region, reaching out to different geographies with soft power and also constructive policies. Nevertheless, EU is not utilizing, engaging Turkey in a meaningful dialogue to develop certain policy actions. This is one thing. Second, Cyprus question. Yes, it was not resolved, and I don't see any hope for the future. Why? Because the EU had admitted the Greek Cypriots as full member of the European Union, and now it is one important element in shaping up realistic policies. And I don't think that the Greek Cypriots have incentives to engage constructively in the negotiating process. Right. Third, for Nagorno-Karabakh question, yes, we wanted to have normalization with Armenia, and we still maintain the hope that it will materialize. And we thought that in such a process, there will be a reinforcing synergies also for the settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh question. When we had the Georgia crisis, we saw that these protracted conflicts for 17, 18 years will have the potential to erupt as wars as we have seen it. And that was the reason Caucasus Stability and Cooperation Platform, the initiative that we proposed, was to have a fresh look, impetus to the protracted conflicts. And I think that all need to reflect on that and re-energize whatever processes that we have in hand.
It'd be a very good conference, actually. We just have one on mistakes of the past. I think one will need quite several days for it. Gentleman at the back there, had his hand up. Stand up, sir, so we can see you. Thank you.
Arthur Lebekas, the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. I'd like to do my bit for gender balance here and address another question to...
I can't hear you. Can you speak?
I'd like to address another question to you, Oksana Antonenko. Taking your point about Russia's Asia policy and the absence of historical baggage, I was wondering if this point could be turned around and be made to apply to Russia's policy vis-à-vis its Western neighbors. Whether, for example, Russia will be, in your view, able or feel itself able to disengage from the Baltic states, for example, or coming back to Transnistria, perhaps what's needed is not a Russian solution, it could be argued, but a Russian disengagement again from Moldova or Transnistria, whether that could happen. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, and then Jana, I don't know whether you're going to defend the ECFR. You don't have to.
Sadly, I missed the first half of the panel, so I can't really respond to the criticism. Maybe just one thing to say about the report. As someone who had the pleasure of working on that report with Mark and Ivan, I think the report is primarily a call on action and a wake-up call for the EU to realize one thing, or maybe a couple of things, which is that our Eastern partners, not all of them want to become as us. Talking to Russia and discussing the interests is not always going to lead to cooperation, even though we understand each other's interests. We have a very different relationship with Turkey than we had before. And doing all of this while relying on the US military power and just promoting the soft power without anything else is no longer working. Now, I'm not sure I have the answer to that question. I'm not sure that the report proposes the answer to that question. But I have a question to the panelists, which is about something different. It's about Nagorno-Karabakh. What you said is, I mean, it asserts a certain sense of urgency, obviously. The question is, what can the EU realistically do? EU is not part of the talks, at least not directly. Mm-hmm. And as we just heard from the panel, if there is a war, if there is a conflict, the first thing to do would be for Turkey and Russia to settle it down, not for the EU. Mm. Thanks.
Very good. Well, we've got 7 minutes before you get into serious hunger problems by missing your lunch. So I'm going to ask the panellists just to respond in sort of a minute or a minute and a half to whatever those questions or anything else that they really want to respond to most. My own 10 seconds worth is that I think it's very interesting that in the entire discussion no one's mentioned any of the structures, OSCE, Community of Democracies, Council of Europe, didn't even feature. I don't know what we read into that, but it's possibly interesting. But let's go from left to right. We'll finish up with the up, start with OKSANA.
Very quickly.
I'm compressing your name. So go ahead.
Yeah. For the Estonian colleague question, I think that what is needed in the relationship between Russia and its Western neighbors is not disengagement, but normalization and reconciliation. A very protracted, long process, but it's absolutely necessary. And if we see the beginning of this process in the Russian-Polish relations, we see beginning of this process in Russian-Latvian relations, we see that certainly in the Russian-Norwegian relations, we see a much more advanced process in the Russian-Finnish relations. I hope Russian-Estonian relations are next. You know, you tell me whether Estonia is ready. But clearly, that is the only way forward. The idea that Russia can just disappear is just naive and unrealistic. I think what is needed is very hard work on both sides of a historic reconciliation and honesty in this relationship. And it's difficult. We know it's very difficult. The second point about Nagorno-Karabakh, what can the EU do? Certainly the EU should be the key player, but you absolutely rightly said that France is blocking EU from joining the Minsk group and becoming a serious player on Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And I think this is shameful. Because if France is very serious about the common EU foreign policy, we need to have serious EU engagement. And the EU can engage, as we see now, EU is engaging in Abkhazia, where it is becoming now a very major donor and doing a lot of projects to try to lessen dependency on Russia and bring it back to the potentially into some sort of political process. We need to do similar things from the EU on Nagorno-Karabakh. We need a very serious package, which the EU did offer on Nagorno-Karabakh settlement before. If a settlement is there, the EU money should be there. And there should be incentives and there should be contingency planning. But that is unfortunately in the current environment not very realistic.
Yeah, I do share your observation as far as the institutional parts of the discussion that nobody mentioned OSCE, nobody mentioned Council of Europe. That was questions or mentioning of NATO because of also the previous session, and it's very important to keep it. And the European Union, that also in a kind of test as far as who could do what. And whether it's just talking shop or vegetarian organization, it's something that could really do something. That's a very important part of that. But second is, again, despite of an overall uncertainty that transpires through the discussion, I do believe that if you employ at least 5-year term, that's going to be a much more optimistic and then certain way to discuss the issues and to solve the problems. Why? Because I do believe that after some obvious problems that EU makes EU inward-looking now, again, business as usual will come back to life. And when the Western Balkans, so the first countries from the Western Balkans, will start joining the European Union, like Croatia sometime, hopefully in the next 5 years or less, so that would be a very important kind of reopening of the appetite. By that time, what is important, that's to show the success stories in the immediate EU neighborhood. And I have a concern now that the mere fundamentals of the European neighborhood policy, namely, and we remember Romano Prodi saying, the organizing idea behind the ENP to create the ring of friends around the European Union who are peaceful, democratic, and prosperous. So if you look now at the Eastern Mediterranean, It's neither peaceful nor democratic and nor prosperous. So the same apply for the eastern part of it. So that it is more opportunity now. My wish, and I want to also to send a very clear point of concern, that with this new appetite because of the obvious event in the Northern Africa, reassessment of the ENP should not lead to just mechanical reassessment and would really need to address an issue of differentiation within the region, which is Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and other countries are part of.
Well, we're going to get on to the lessons from the south later on in the conference, but for now, SERHAT.
Okay, a few points to make since there are no questions directed at me. The issues OKSANA raised, Cyprus and Armenia, and Turkey is supposed to deliver on them. Cyprus is a very complicated issue, and an ambassador, you may ask him how many initiatives Turkey said yes, and Greek Cypriot said no, to unblock the stalemate. As for Armenia, the protocols, I think the protocols serve the immediate purpose they were supposed to serve, to preempt a potential crisis with the incoming U.S. administration, whose key members committed themselves to recognize the tragedy of 1915 as a genocide. So the tendency might be to think them as an extension of Davutoğlu's famous zero problems with neighbors policy, but functionally they achieved their immediate objective. That's what I would like to say about the protocols so far. So whether they will be revitalized or not is another issue. But for the protocols, Turkey, in the short run, got what it wanted.
But it also provoked escalation of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict.
Yeah, anyway. And, well, to conclude, European Union is a victim of its own success as regards to Turkey, indeed. Because reforms have emancipated Turkish foreign policy. Turkey used to be a status quo power, terribly fearful of change in and around the country. Now it is not only a supporter but a promoter of political and economic change around in its neighborhood. And as long as Turkey was harnessed, Turkey's potential was harnessed to a European perspective, Turkey was useful. I'll give you an example. Very quick one. On the eve of the Iraqi war, Turkish foreign policy resembled the foreign policies of the old Europe, not the new Europe. And this was not very much appreciated. And I remember a study which compared Turkey's warring patterns in the United Nations, and Turkish warring patterns were similar to those of the mainstream EU positions. What was the game changer was the year 2008, when Turks lost their hopes about, when the promise of membership was decoupled from the framework, then Turks began to realize that they may better act alone. Thank you.
And final word to you, Jan.
I would like to end with a positive remark, also with a view to the perspective 2025. I do not agree that the European Union is a victim of its own success. It's a question of absorption capacity. And I think that is, we have to realize that more or less it's finished for quite a while, but that doesn't mean that we do not have sufficient instruments to bring on board to develop a constructive relationship with the neighbors. I think we should perhaps, for the future, of course, try to keep intact communication channels with regard to security issues, but perhaps concentrate more on the economic instruments. That means, as far as I'm concerned, with regard to relations with Russia, let them accede to WTO, start economic cooperation. There are tremendous possibilities for the bigger firms, for the smaller and the medium-sized firms, and that will create stability in itself. It's after the example of how we created the European Union to bring in economic instruments first. With Turkey, we have already achieved quite an extensive degree of cooperation, not to say integration, by creating this customs union, and let's work from there and let's see how far we can get. And let's take these models for Russia and for Turkey as an example for the Southern Caucasus, for Belarus, for Moldova, for Ukraine, and let's try to stimulate, my last remark, forms of regional cooperation also in Northern Africa. Not easy. We all know that Morocco, Algeria have difficulties. The same goes for Tunisia, for Egypt, and not to talk about Libya. But I think there the message should be, take also Europe as an example and try to stimulate something useful in a regional context.
Well, thanks very much indeed.
Positive.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm just imagining the message going to North Africa of trust us. We've sorted out all these frozen conflicts and other problems in our region. Now we're coming to help you.
2025.
You've had plenty of food for thought. Now it's time for food. But please join me in thanking the panelists for their excellent contributions.